Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well today. This video is just going to do a review of some of the material we've talked about in class regarding the advantages and disadvantages of this ethic of prima facie duties. So in the video, we're going to start just by reviewing what this ethic of prima facie duties are, some of the fundamental features of it. Then we'll review Ross's intuitionism, this theory about how we come to know about morality. We'll talk about the advantages of this approach to ethics and some of the disadvantages as well. So let's start out just by reviewing what this theory says the nature of morality is. So remember, it starts out with this idea of a prima facie duty. This is a strong, permanent, but non-absolute moral reason, or you might call it a moral consideration, for either doing or not doing an action. So the fact that something keeps a promise, the fact that something does good for another person, the fact that something does not cause harm to another person, the fact that it does justice, the fact that it shows gratitude for some good that someone's done for you. All of those are strong, permanent, but not absolute moral reasons or considerations in favor of doing the action. So this theory attempts to use this idea of a prima facie duty to illuminate what the nature of morality overall is. So just a couple reminders of some of the features of this ethical approach. Firstly, Ross's ethic of prima facie duties is pluralistic. So there are multiple fundamental moral considerations. So at the foundation of morality is not just a single duty or moral consideration that we need to take into account, like utilitarianism, where it's just about how much overall well-being you can produce in the world. On this theory, there are several moral considerations that are equally fundamental for understanding the nature of morality. This theory also rejects the idea that there are any absolute moral rules. So these moral considerations at the foundation of morality are all non-absolute or inconclusive. So none of them are strong enough to guarantee that an action is right or wrong. It's always possible that there could be other opposing moral considerations that would outweigh those prima facie duties. There's also this idea of moral conflict. So these fundamental moral considerations will often conflict with one another, will often pull people in different directions. So one prima facie duty of you ought to keep your promises might pull the action towards being right, but the other prima facie duty of not harming someone might pull it towards being wrong in a situation where, for instance, you keeping your promise would end up hurting another person. So on this theory, there then becomes this question of, well, if these can conflict with one another, if I can have prima facie duties pull me in different directions, well, what's actually the morally right thing to do? Which of those prima facie duties ought I actually fulfill? The morally right action is going to be whichever fulfills the strongest moral consideration or the strongest, most important prima facie duty in that particular situation when you have figured out all of the considerations, all of the prima facie duties, and weighed them against one another. Now, Ross's theory also thinks of morality as being objective. So the prima facie duties are objective in the sense that you have those prima facie duties to keep your promises, to do justice, to do good for others, not to cause harm. Those prima facie duties apply to you regardless of what your beliefs or feelings or desires are. So even if someone doesn't believe that keeping promises is important, Ross thinks still they have a prima facie duty to keep their promises. That is an objective fact about how morality works. Similarly, even when we talk about not just prima facie duties, but our all things considered duty, or the morally right thing to do in any individual situation, he thinks there will be an objective truth about which prima facie duty is strongest in that situation. And by objective truth here, I mean the fact that that is the strongest prima facie duty doesn't depend on what any person believes, desires, or feels. So all of that is just a review of some of the features about what Ross's theory tells us the nature of morality is. But we can now ask, well, if that's what morality is, how do we gain knowledge about morality? Now, Ross believes we can only gain moral knowledge by using a kind of moral intuition. So there's two aspects we need to consider here. How does our intuition give us knowledge about the prima facie duties that apply to us? How does our intuition help us gain knowledge about what the actually right thing to do is, or the all things considered right thing to do is in any given situation? So regarding the prima facie duties, Ross thinks that if I adequately understand, say, what a promise is, then my intuitive grasp of the idea of a promise will allow me to intuitively gain 100% certain knowledge that I have a prima facie duty to keep a promise. So, some analogies to try to understand this. If I adequately understand what numbers are and what addition is and how it works, then my intuitive grasp of the number 2 and addition can help me come to 100% certainty that 2 plus 2 equals 4, just by thinking very carefully about what these ideas are. Similarly, if I adequately understand the idea of a bachelor, well, then I can just think about that idea very closely of what a bachelor is to intuitively grasp with 100% certainty that there are no married bachelors. I know that just by considering the very idea of what a bachelor is. But what about figuring out what the actual all things considered duty is? So in a particular situation, what is morally right to do? Now notice, knowing what the prima facie duties are, even if I have 100% certainty that I have a prima facie duty of keeping promises, that is insufficient for knowing what action is morally right, since several of those prima facie duties that I know about would apply in any given situation, and they might be pulling me in different directions. And so to know what action is morally right in any individual situation, first of all, I need to learn what the details of that situation are. Did I make any promises? Will this do justice? Will this do injustice? Will this do good for other people? Will it harm anybody else? I need to figure out what's actually happening in the situation. After I've done that, I then need to determine which prima facie duties are relevant. Well, if I made a promise, then my prima facie duty of fidelity is relevant to that situation. If my action is going to harm or hurt another person, then my prima facie duty of non-maleficence is relevant. So once I've figured out what the situation is, which prima facie duties are relevant, then I need to weigh those prima facie duties against one another, if they're pulling in different directions, in order to determine which of those prima facie duties turns out to be the strongest in that individual situation. Now, according to Ross, though, there is no principle or formula or calculation that I can go through that would be able to tell me which of those prima facie duties is strongest. The only thing I can do is rely on my own intuition or best judgment about which of those is strongest or most important in that situation. Because of that, when we form beliefs about what's right to do, or I make a decision about what I'm going to do, there's always a risk. So because one, my beliefs about what situation I'm in could be mistaken. There might be some details that I've just missed or didn't know about. Moreover, even if I did know all the details of my situation, well, my intuitions could make a mistake about how it weighs the prima facie duties against one another. My intuition might weigh fidelity as being more important than non-maleficence in my situation, even though, as an objective fact of the matter, the duty of non-maleficence is actually stronger. So my intuition might weigh them incorrectly in a way that doesn't match how they actually weigh against one another in the real world. And so because of those possible mistakes, we can never be 100% certain which action is truly the morally right one. My beliefs about what is all things considered the right thing to do can only be the best educated belief. It can never be certain. All right, so some advantages of this kind of moral theory are it allows a kind of moral flexibility. These prima facie duties, as we mentioned, are non-absolute. They can always be outweighed by stronger competing considerations. And so that means Ross's theory accommodates that idea that morality is flexible enough to adapt to the situation we're in, and would thereby allow us to sometimes break conventional moral rules depending on those situations. So yes, I have a prima facie duty to tell the truth. But in a situation where a murderer is knocking on my door, well, it looks like my friend's well-being is a more important moral consideration than the consideration of telling the truth. And so in that case, I might be allowed to have some flexibility and lie. Another advantage we talked about was related to moral complexity. The idea here is just, look, in a lot of situations, we get the feeling, we get the sense that morality is complex. There's many considerations that need to be weighed against one another. We get the feeling that it would oversimplify things to try to boil morality down to just one single rule or consideration. Like with utilitarianism, it tries to boil morality down to the one consideration of how much well-being does it create in the world. But in a lot of actual scenarios, it just feels like there's just more to consider than how much well-being is created. And Ross's theory matches that feeling that we get, because it suggests there really are multiple fundamental moral considerations, and none of them can be explained in terms of the others. Now, Ross's theory also has the advantage here of accommodating our common sense moral beliefs. So the idea here is just when you consider a number of examples, we have intuitive judgments that say it's wrong to harvest someone's organs in order to save 5 people's lives. Intuitively, we think that it's okay to lie in a situation where it's going to save the life of our friend from that of a murderer at our door looking for them. Ross's theory is made in such a way that it can match these common sense answers. Ross can say that in the organ harvesting case, yes, you have a duty of beneficence to save these 5 lives, a prima facie duty, but you also have a prima facie duty of justice, so not to violate the rights of this healthy person and take their organs without their consent. They don't deserve that. All right. And now Ross can say, and that duty of justice in the organ harvesting case is stronger than the prima facie duty of beneficence. And so, yes, the right thing to do is to let the 5 die and not harvest this person's organs. But in like the murder at the door example, you can say, in this case, maybe the duties of beneficence or non-maleficence outweigh our duty of truth-telling, for instance. And so in that case, it would be morally right to lie to the murderer at the door. Yet again, vindicating our common sense reaction to that case. Ross's theory also seems to have some advantage when we consider like our experience of moral conflict. Ross's theory explains why we often feel like we are pulled in multiple directions and we won't be able to fill all of the duties that arise within that situation. That is, oftentimes when we try to make a decision, we feel some things point us one way, we feel some things point another. This makes sense on Ross's theory because there really are multiple considerations that pull us in different directions. And Ross's theory accommodates that feeling without leading to a contradiction because none of those considerations are absolute rules. They are all prima facie duties. Ross's theory also seems to have an advantage in making sense of our experience of moral regret. Oftentimes, we feel regret even when we know that we did the right thing, that we made the right decision. Ross's theory explains why it's appropriate to feel that kind of regret. Because even when I do the right thing, well, that prima facie duty that was pulling me in the other direction, that was outweighed, well, it doesn't go away. It was still there. And so when I break a promise to a friend to help a person that's in need on the side of the road that just had a car accident, the idea is, yeah, I did the right thing, but I feel regret because I am perceiving the fact that even in that situation where I did the right thing, I still had this prima facie duty of keeping my promise, and I couldn't fulfill it. I had to give up something of moral value, of moral importance, in order to do the right thing, and I feel regret about the fact that I had to give up that morally important thing, even though I know that what I did was the morally right thing. On the other hand, though, Ross's theory does have a lot of worries or disadvantages. One of these has to do with not our experience of moral conflict, but how we go about trying to resolve those moral conflicts. So Ross's theory doesn't really seem to give us any satisfying guidance about what to do or how to figure out which prima facie duty is the most important thing, when those prima facie duties are pulling us in different directions. It doesn't give us any guidance about how to weigh them against one another, or it doesn't tell us how much weight any of them have. On Ross's view, all we can do is rely on our intuition to figure out which one is more important. But why should we trust our intuition to get it right? If we start to worry that our intuition might not be trustworthy, what could we do? What process could we go through to try to figure out which of these duties we ought to be weighing more strongly? Ross just doesn't seem to have any answer that he can give. And related to this, Ross also thereby has difficulty giving us guidance about how to try to resolve disagreement between different people. So, look, people often have different moral intuitions. Consider the kind of disagreements that arise regarding capital punishment or abortion. Oftentimes, people might agree about all the facts on the ground, about how much capital punishment costs, about how well it deters crime, etc. But people might still have different intuitions about maybe which of these moral considerations are most important. So one person might think the fact that maybe capital punishment doesn't keep us any safer, doesn't have good results, etc., doesn't really prevent crime, they might think that that is the most important, the strongest moral consideration, such that we shouldn't have capital punishment. On the other side, someone might agree with all the facts, but think, but look, there's still this moral consideration of justice. This person did something wrong and thereby deserves punishment. And they might have the intuition that this duty of justice is stronger in that situation. When people have those different intuitions about which prima facie duty is strongest in a situation, well, how do we go about trying to figure out whose intuition is correct and whose intuition is incorrect? Well, if all we can rely on is our intuitions, it seems like when we get into those disagreements, we just get to a point where all we can do is stomp our foot and insist we're right, that our intuition is correct. But the other side can do that as well. And so it's not clear that we can really make progress in trying to resolve that disagreement. People also worry that maybe Ross's theory encourages a kind of dogmatism in our attitudes. So dogmatism here you can think of as a kind of stubbornness in your belief, a kind of closed-mindedness, an irrational stubbornness in one's beliefs. So the idea is, look, if our intuitions are all that we can rely on, then this might encourage us just to rely on our intuition and insist that we are correct when other people disagree with us, because there's not much else that we can do. But the problem with that is it seems to be dogmatic. It seems to be stubborn or close-minded to think that your intuitions have to be the ones that are right rather than people who have different intuitions than you. Why should I think that my intuitions are any more likely to be reliable than someone else's? I can't appeal to any kind of argument or reasoning or procedure to show that my intuition is right. And so it looks like it's just foot-stamping dogmatism. And so it seems like that encourages a kind of closed-mindedness maybe that would make it difficult for us to learn from others that might have different perspectives from us. Now, I think there's some things Ross can say here to try to avoid this worry, to try to mitigate it, to try to condemn a kind of closed-mindedness, since we should consider the fact that we're just as fallible as anybody else. And so it's just as likely that someone with a different intuition has it right than we do. This also relates to another worry, that of bias. So people's intuitions, mine and yours, often seem to be influenced by biases and prejudices that we get from our upbringing, our culture, our religion, etc. And so if those intuitions are all we can rely on for weighing the prima facie duties against one another and determining what is the morally right thing to do in a situation, well, and those intuitions are often the result of bias, then we might worry that maybe we shouldn't trust our intuitions or anybody else's, because theirs are likely to be the result of bias as well. But then we might just find ourselves in a kind of moral skepticism where we think that we just can't know what the right thing to do is, because we can't trust our intuitions and we have nothing else to go on. Someone might also worry that Ross's intuitionism might encourage people to engage in a kind of rationalization of their beliefs. The idea here is that Ross's view might lead us into a situation where we form the belief that a prima facie duty is the most important, but we do so not because we have any good reason or argument or principle to support the idea that that is the most important prima facie duty in that situation, but rather we just form the belief that that's the most important one because it's going to confirm what we already believe is the answer about what's right or wrong to do in that situation. So the idea is, it looks like maybe we just decide that this is wrong, and then we look for the prima facie duty that's going to match what we think is wrong, and then we'll just say that that's the strongest prima facie duty because that matches what we've already decided is true. It looks like we're starting with a conclusion and then coming up with our premises after we've already decided the conclusion. And that means it looks like Ross's theory might enable us to engage in a kind of confirmation bias towards our own beliefs. And again, that might make it very difficult for us to try to make progress and to correct our own mistakes if we are encouraged to engage in this kind of reasoning where we just start with our conclusion and then find reasons to back it up afterwards. Well, then obviously we're just always going to find reasons that support what we already believe, but then we can't fix the mistakes in our beliefs. Now, like I said, I think there's a lot of things Ross can say here to try to get out of these worries. But these are very important worries that Ross and the ethic of prima facie duties needs to consider and try to say something about before we should adopt these theories. All right, that's all for this video. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.